These are the Rocky Mountains over here, right? This is the western slope of the Rocky Mountains, right? And this is the only river that makes its way through the big mountains, right? These are 10,000 foot mountains, right? Mount Adams is about here, right? And Mount Hood is right here. And these are both over 10,000 feet. And so, and this is the only river that pounds its way through, right? There's a spine of mountains that goes all the way down through California, and they call it the Sierra Nevada in California. But if you look on a map, there's no river that does that except the Columbia. And these forests, all of these communities on the western slope of the Rocky Mountains, we now know, thanks to the careful work of geologists and agronomists and soil scientists and foresters, we now know that all these forests on the western slope of the Colorado Rockies depend on isotopes that are brought in the bodies of salmon, right? Literally. It's really amazing. I don't know if you guys appreciate it, but imagine the Pacific Ocean, right? And then all the way down to Santa Barbara. There's evidence actually that there were salmon-bearing streams all the way down to Baja California, right? But most, but in the last few thousand years at least, the southernmost limit of salmon habitat is around Santa Barbara, California, right? Around the 35th parallel latitude. Somewhere around there. Yeah.
I'm sorry, isotopes?
Just things that are brought in the bodies of salmon that provide essential nutriments.
Okay.
Indispensable nutriments, which all of the vegetative life on the western side of the Rockies has evolved in codependency with, is the point. And observed illnesses and senescence and dying off, to use a layman's term. All these forests are dying off. And one cause of the dying off of these forests, of course, anthropogenic climate destabilization, lack of rain, all that has something to do with it, and massive wildfires, right? And poor forestry practices, and elimination of our friend the wolf, right? All of these things. You wouldn't believe how much elimination of the wolf contributes to these massive forest fires. We don't give enough credit to our furry friends and the things that they do. But basically, there used to be thousands and thousands of bears, right? And the bears would eat the carcasses of the salmon. After the salmon spawn, they die, and their carcasses just lie around there, right? And the bears come down and eat them, and then the bears wander all over the forest and they poop out that stuff and that stuff originates in the North Pacific, right? Those isotopes that those forests need. So the salmon are the silver thread that weaves together the entire ecosystem, from our relatives here to our human relatives here, all the way to the extent to the far perimeter, right? The extremities. These are the extremities of the body, right? These streams, right? The little tiny streams ultimately are the fingers of this organism. Does that answer your question? That's a scientific, thing that you study in an ecology class.
Okay, I was just saying that, you might want to regard this as, isotopes refers to something very specific, so.
Yeah.
It's just the nitrogen cycle, so the salmon, their flesh has nitrogen in it, and
Yeah.
it's redistributed into the ecosystem by omnivores like critters.
Yeah. So, you can think of all these are the arteries of the organism, which we might, and then we don't need to be making any metaphysical commitments when we describe this as an organism, right? We can just be like Norton, right? And Norton would recognize that there are certain practical conditions that need to be met in order for this to be considered a healthy ecosystem, right? And one of those practical conditions is that the arteries of this ecosystem need to be flowing somewhere, not entirely the way they were 1,000 years ago or 200 years ago, but somewhere closer to the flow rate that our salmon evolved in, okay? Salmon are pretty amazing. But anyway, if you think about it, basically, picture this. Every single body of water connected to the Pacific Ocean between Santa Barbara in the south, right, in Southern California, all the way up the coastline of the United States and then up the coastline of British Columbia and then up the coastline of Alaska, and then around to Siberia, Kamchatka Peninsula, and then down to North Korea, and then all the way to Japan. The entire North Pacific Rim. Every single body of water was clogged on an annual basis, sometimes 2 or 3 times per year, clogged with spawning salmon, right? And that's kind of amazing that this animal evolved, this fish evolved to do that. And they colonized too. 10 to 15% of every salmon, of every distinct salmon run will stray. They'll stray to different parts of their watershed. And that's how they colonize new areas, right? It's really kind of amazing, this resource that existed, and it goes back, right, millions of years. They were blocked off during the last ice age, right? They went extinct basically during the last ice age, except for a few coastal, because this was all ice, right? They couldn't get up there. But then after the ice receded, within a few million years, within a few, fairly soon, they were able to recolonize the entire Columbia Basin again. So anyway, this is the sort of thing that calls out greater, perhaps, right? Rolson would say the more you know about this ecosystem, the more intimate your obligations appear to you, right? Because he would say that, the relationships that we've just described between, for example, these forests over here, and these salmon, and these orcas up here, and these humans down here, these relationships all reflect a set of abstract binding obligations. And these are real obligations that we have to each other. And because obligations are not just subjectively generated, right? Anyway, that's kind of an amazing assertion. The idea that we have objective obligations reflected in ecological laws. All right, so what do we have in mind for today? Today we want to try to get a better understanding of what Thomas Birch is trying to say. And we went through all this, this material on the Stevens treaties. I keep including it in this class, even though I started including it 5 or 6 years ago because I was just, I didn't know really how to teach the class, and I thought this would be a good way to fill time. I don't know, but now I realize that it's not really, this. I gave you guys kind of just a historical lecture, really, but perhaps it's instructive for an environmental ethics class because it reminds us that there was this other culture of very sophisticated all human beings are incredibly sophisticated. They really are, when you get right down to it. I mean, if you let human beings do their thing, then they end up producing these amazing works of art, and they produce these amazing abstract ideas, philosophies, and metaphysics. And anyway, and these people, they had all that. And they also had this idea that their identities as people were contingent on their relationship with the salmon and with the rivers, right? And so they insisted, when they were confronted with these foreigners who had overwhelming force, right? They had overwhelming military superiority, and they knew that they didn't have a chance against these foreigners. They did the best that they could to try to provide for their descendants that these relationships that they enjoyed with the fish and with the river would be maintained, right? Economically and culturally. And perhaps it's instructive for us to think about that, to think about, what their ethic might be. Why did they do that? Why were they so careful to protect their fishing rights? And anyway, and ask, well, did they do that for their own tribal, their own anthropocentric reasons, right? Because they wanted to have more fish to eat? Or did they do that because you know, because they thought the fish themselves had rights, right? What exactly are they thinking when they are so careful to ensure that? And probably the answer is that when we try to analyze their relationship with the salmon in that way through our Western paradigm, right? Then probably we're off track. And probably they understand the web, and perhaps someone like Weston, who talks about webs of values, would be, perhaps that's a better way of understanding their relationship with the salmon and the rivers. So anyway, that's why I present this material. It seems like an important part of being ecologically literate, at the very least, in the Pacific Northwest. You can't really call yourself, to be environmentally literate, you have to understand this history, I think. You have to understand the struggles that have gone down over the generations between. And by the way, there's a great book that's available at the library, I think maybe just through interlibrary loan or Summit or something, but on Celilo Falls, written from an indigenous point of view, and it's just an amazing set of stories. And I have to write it on the board because it's spelled differently. But it's called the Celilo Way. Those of you who are interested in this. And it's spelled and I forget the authors. It's co-written by 3 different authors. Anyway, for those of you who are really interested in the history of treaty fishing rights especially in the Columbia Basin, then that would be. And there's some great books also written on the fish wars in the Puget Sound area. That was a really big deal in the 50s and 60s and 70s, especially up in the Puget Sound area. All those rivers that empty out of the Olympic Peninsula have very, very valuable and rich salmon runs in them. And so these native people that lived up there, they had rights under these Stevens treaties, and they would go and fish in violation of the law deliberately. And they would call the cops. They'd say, we're going to go do this right now, and they'd call these news people, media people, and even some celebrities like Marlon Brando and some other fairly famous people would come to bring more media attention, and then they would be arrested, and then the fishermen would be arrested, right, and sent off to jail, and in some cases tried, prosecuted, and convicted, and then their attorneys would start raising the treaty rights issues, and eventually they got the state off their backs, right? And now the state of Washington leaves them alone. They're not harassed anymore the way they were, because their treaty rights were upheld. And for a while, the federal judiciary actually was managing the fishery. It was that bad. People don't appreciate this part of our history, but and maybe it wasn't so bad. As I understand, it wasn't so bad down here. But up there in Washington, it was kind of like it was analogous to the civil rights struggle in the southeastern part of the United States. The fish-ins were analogous to the sit-ins at the lunch counters. Black people, right? African Americans would go sit in. And anyway, the civil rights struggle centered on the fishing rights of indigenous people. And they ended up prevailing in court, and now, they're left alone. They're left to do their... And up there, evidently, it's considerably more valuable. Their fishing rights are more valuable because there are a lot more fish remaining in the streams and rivers up there. But, so let's take our break, and we'll come back and talk some more about Thomas Birch, okay? Let's just come back at the top of the hour.
Yeah.
Cool, huh? I see, isn't that interesting? So the hydrography was already there. I see.
And there's evidence that with the granular flood results.
Uh-huh. I see. What about the Klamath? The Klamath kind of cuts through, doesn't it? But really just kind of originates in the high.
More so it jogs through
It jogs through, yeah.
with the contours of the environment.
Uh-huh.
But the Columbia is the only one that has.
And then the Colorado, it's just lazy. It just says, all right, man, it's gonna go down there in the Gulf of Mexico and to hell with all these mountains, right? Colorado's an amazing river too, though. Wow, they totally demolished the Colorado. Uncle Aldo actually has a, I'm not sure if it's in Sand County Almanac or one of his other books, but he has an account of the trip that he and his brother took down to the mouth of the Colorado River, where it empties into the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of California there. And his descriptions are just breathtaking. He saw so much wildlife there, it was unbelievable. And now it's just a trickle, of course. If you go there now, there's nothing. It's just a wasteland. And it's so sad to think about that. But he saw black pumas, you know. He saw just thousands and thousands of waterfowl. And that's all gone now. It's really heartbreaking to think about stuff like that.
Actually, those work for.
Okay, that Hanford place is the most contaminated nuclear site in the U.S.
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
That's pretty messed up.
Yeah. Well,
It says they left 53 million gallons of wastewater in there somewhere.
yeah.
And they leaked about 1,200 in 2010. That is messed up. I'm never swimming in the Columbia.
I know, right?
Yeah, I'm like, I know that.
Yeah.
And that's up the river. You just never hear about it. You know, like I lived here for like 16 years.
No, that's fine. It's always weird. These things that are like, oh yeah, there's this thing like way over there.
Yeah.
It's actually not that far away.
Yeah.
Anyway, we didn't really finish our discussion of our plans for our final exam. But somebody asked, yeah, so I started to say that it may be somewhat unpopular. And I found over the years that most students in this class tend to come from a radical environmentalist point of view, Leopoldian or something, and so, but they're going, maybe we can have a smaller group. In fact, probably that's what we'll do. The group that represents the anti-dam removal point of view will be somewhat smaller than the group that represents, than the environmental community. And then the environmental, it'll be the pro-dam community versus the environmental community, okay? And the environmental community will have all kinds of different branches to it, right? And the two main branches, which will then branch off in, two main branches are the anthro branch and then the more than anthro branch, right? That's how it'll be, okay? So, and then it'll be up to the coordinators of each group to assign roles to the various members of the group, okay? That's kind of how I envision it happening, all right? And then the roles will be kind of a little bit predefined. You know, I'll lay out the roles for you a little bit in advance, but I want each group to feel free too, though, to construct their presentation as they see fit. All right, so I kind of want to have some guidelines and some expectation, especially from the environmental group side, right? Because you guys are going to be expected to have some of you present from a more than anthropocentric perspective, right? A Rolstonian kind of perspective. And then some of you are going to want to present more from a Wilson kind of Norton, right? I'm going to expect that. Some of you are going to give me, the strong anthro arguments in favor of dam removal, right? And then some of you are going to give me the strong the ecocentric arguments in favor of dam removal. Then, of course, on the other side, those of you who, are going to play that role are mostly going to draw from, right, the usual suspects, right? The usual individual anthros are all up in here, right? You got your, you got your nihilists, right? Perhaps some of those dam defenders are nihilists, egoists, right? You got your egoists, and of course you got your utilitarians, and of course you have your classical virtue ethicists, who these are all strong anthropocentrists, right? And then you have your classical Kantians, right, or deontologists slash Kantians, and then you have, anyway, it looks like I drew a few too many lines in there, but you see, right, but actually right here, nope, we have the neo-Humeans, and then you have your virtue ethicists, and then you have your and this would be Baxter is your big resource. I mean, Baxter is your friend, right? Baxter is always your friend if you're defending the oil company point of view, if you're defending the frackers' point of view, if you're defending the dam supporters, right? Keep the dams in place. If you're defending that point of view, Baxter's your friend, all the way down the line, right? And Baxter is this combination, in a way, he's making this Kantian claim. Remember his spheres of freedom argument, right? In a way, he's making this Kantian argument. In a way, he's making this utilitarian argument. He's against waste, right? And he says humans are the only ones, ultimately, who can be the measurer of value in natural resource. There is no normative nature, right? There's that claim looming large, slamming the door, right? There is no normative nature. To hell with you, Rolston, all these other guys are out of the picture, right? In that one fell swoop. Anyway, right? So those of you who are on the side of the man, right, of the establishment, keep the dams in place. Even though they were just make-work projects to begin with, and they're totally pointless, they generate 4% of the region's electricity. There really aren't any good you guys got to come up with them, right? You guys got to put lipstick on the pig, right? That's what they do. That's the thing you don't forget, right? The people who make these decisions, they are using arguments. Don't ever forget that. They have to. They can't just say we're doing this and then do it, right? They have to go to the public and explain why. Thank goodness we make them do that, right? We still have a system that makes them do that. We don't have an autocracy that just says, we're going to do this and build the new Trump dam or something, right? Right? So anyway, they have to use arguments, and you will notice that they do this ad hoc thing. They pick and choose. They grab wherever they can, right? And then they throw those arguments long enough, right? But their arguments never have integrity, though, too. You'll notice that. I mean, they don't have, and that's what we're looking for. And that ultimately is an environmental ethicist grievance against many of these arguments, is that they simply are not taking into consideration enough of what needs to be taken into consideration, and so they lack integrity. Right? Yes, go ahead.
So we can't call dibs right now?
You can't do what?
We can't call dibs.
Let's wait until Tuesday, okay? Do you want to be a corporate executive?
I want to be individual anthropocentrist. That'll be fun.
Just denouncing the Walden Pond hippies? Yeah. All right. That's what Baxter does, right? It's a very effective argument. So that'll be fun, right? And it will be kind of fun. Those of you who participated in our final exam project, you will have a lot of fun. And I hope it will, and it's supposed to be fun. It's It's not supposed to be intimidating. But what it involves is an effort to kind of think about the relevance of the material we've been covering all term long and how it actually plays out. And you will find that it's now much easier for you to describe the kinds of arguments in favor, the kinds of arguments that are made in favor of keeping the dams, in favor of opposing the oil terminal in Vancouver, right? And you'll... So, anyway, but no, let's not call this, let's figure all that out. I don't know how we're, but next week we'll figure it out. This is week 7 already, right? My goodness. Well, I'm not sure if I need these lecture notes anymore. Yeah, this is that passage in U.S. v. Winans that I skipped over on right here. I've quoted a lengthy passage from the majority opinion. This is the Supreme Court issuing a decision in a fishing rights case in 1905, and this involved those fish wheels again. Where are the darn fish wheels? There they are. That was the very next slide. These fish wheels would be located by those people who wanted to exploit, who made a great deal of money by exploiting the salmon resource. These fish wheels would be commonly sighted at usual and accustomed fishing stations. Remember, there are 400, 500, 600 usual and accustomed fishing stations between Bonneville Dam and Celilo Falls. And these things were outlawed, by the way. It's kind of a historical point of historical interest by citizens' initiative. It was put on the ballot in Oregon in the 1920s. We were first, right? Because on the Columbia River, Oregon, right, the boundary between Washington and Oregon goes right down the middle of the Columbia River. And so anyway, we outlawed fish wheels on our side of the river in about, I think, 1926 or so. Anyway, in the 1920s, and then in the 1930s, Washington followed suit also through citizens' initiative. These fish wheels were considered so egregious and so harmful to the fisheries that finally the citizens became outraged and they decided to vote on making them illegal. You can still see, when you drive up to Columbia, you can still see the remnants of a few fish wheels. But anyway, the Winans family, the fish barons, these Winans people had installed these fish wheels right where the native people had usual, they were accustomed to fishing right there, and so they filed suit. And lo and behold, the court agreed with them. And this is some of the language from that court's decision. This Supreme Court justice wrote that the right to resort to the fishing places in controversy was a part of larger rights possessed by the Indians, upon the exercise of which there was not a shadow of impediment, and which were not much less necessary to the existence of the Indians than the atmosphere they breathed. Right? Moral claims. Right? Remember, a moral claim is being made wherever there is a physical necessity being manifest, right? And here, the analogy is very strong analogy, right? I mean, what greater moral claim than that a human could make, right? Than a claim on the atmosphere, because that's the most necessary thing, right? That's before water even, right? You go without air for just a minute, you're toast, right? So anyway, very strong moral claim every human being makes to the air, right? And what is this Supreme Court justice saying? He's saying, after he studied here, he heard all the testimony and he examined the situation as closely as he could, and he determined that the plaintiffs, or the people who were suing, right, on the United States government was suing on behalf of the treaty tribes, right? And this Supreme Court justice determined that they had these moral claims that were almost as strong as their moral claims to breathing clean air, okay? And then along came these new conditions, right? All these European people invaded their territory. And their moral claims, their rights, had to be accommodated, all right? So they started with this, all these rights, the whole plenitude of rights, right? Everything around them they had rights to use and occupy, right? And now with these new conditions, they realized that all those rights were in jeopardy and they could all be gone. So they better negotiate something and save some of them, the most important ones, right? But before they had them all, right? So you can't think of the federal government as giving them rights. No, they reserved rights that they already had. And then they gave up a whole bunch of other ones, right? All right, so only a limitation of their moral claims, of their rights, was necessary and intended, not a taking away. In other words, the treaty was not a grant of rights to the Indians, but a grant of rights from them, and a reservation of those not granted, okay? And the form of the instrument and its language was adapted to that purpose. Reservations were not of particular parcels of land and could not be expressed in deeds as dealings between private individuals, okay, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, they reserved rights, however, okay, to every individual as though named therein. They imposed a servitude. There's a language of a lawyer language, lawyer word, right? Servitude means that the state of Washington and the state of Oregon has a servitude, right? That's what that's how a lawyer would describe its obligations. It has a servitude to protect access and allocation rights, right? Ultimately, this is US v. Wine. This is 1905, by the way. This is 1905. This is long before. This is almost 70 years before the Bolt decision, okay? And remember the Bolt, so this is a decision affecting access rights. Okay? This is just an access rights decision. The Indians were aggrieved because their access to their usual and accustomed fishing site had been obstructed. Right? That's all they cared about was access. You guys need to let me in so I can do my fishing. Right? The Bolt decision was all about allocation. Right? And that was 70 years later. Anyway, but here, the court is using this term, servitude. And what they're saying is that every piece of land that they have usual and accustomed fishing sites on has an easement built into it. The deed, the title that those European people, the settlers, right? Ben Cartwright and all those kind of people, the title that they got, did you get that Bonanza reference? Anyway. Ben Cartwright, the great rancher. Anyway. The title that they had, right? They thought, hey, this is mine. I can do whatever I want. I can build fences. I can put in a fish wheel. I can do whatever the hell I want. It's my land, right? This is America, right? It turns out, all of a sudden, these landowners thought they had free and clear title. All of a sudden, it turns out that the judge, the Supreme Court, the damn Supreme Court is telling them that there's a servitude, an easement, basically. There's an easement on their land. And they have to let people cross their land and sometimes camp for a while during fishing season. Sometimes they camp for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. Anyway, so there was an exclusive right of fishing reserved within certain boundaries, right? Off reservation, okay? Outside of those boundaries reserved in common with citizens of the territory.